Now that you've finished an animated scene, completing your modeling, texturing, and lighting and animation stages, let's look at how we can set up an initial render to render out a series of images as a sequence. We'll then look at how we can combine these images into a video and produce the final result. Here we are then in my scene, and I have a simple mushroom that I've modeled and brought in here, and I've given it a lighting setup. You can see I've got a 3-point lighting setup here with shadows, etc., and just an omni down here to give it some fill. Nothing too exciting. What I have done is I have animated a little bit of a motion to my camera and also a turntable on my mushroom, just to give demonstration of how to render out a series of frames instead of just a static frame. So I'd like to output the final result here as something that I can show to my friends, show to potential employers, etc. And so obviously I can't keep it as this simple 3D Studio file. What I have to do is create a rendered output. So what we can do is we can come under our rendering tab here and go to render, and this will just give me a static frame as it appears looking through my camera, only in this case it's rendering it out to a higher quality result. Now I'm just using the standard scanline renderer that comes with 3D Studio right now, and so it looks a little bit harsh. The edges aren't anti-aliased very nicely. If I go to my render presets here, I can select from these options. I could try perhaps 3D Studio scanline no advanced lighting high. I can load in the presets for these render settings, and all I'm doing when I do this is I'm just changing a bunch of sliders and options to give me different results. You know, the better the quality, the longer the render. So I've improved my scanline results here. It's taking slightly longer to render, but you can see I'm getting some nice anti-aliasing here, and the result is already looking better. Now what I would recommend you use is actually the Mental Ray renderer, which is a third-party renderer from Mental Images, and it gives, in my opinion, far better results than the standard 3D Studio scanline renderer. So I'm going to use Mental Ray No GI, which stands for No Global Illumination, because I just have some basic lighting here in my scene. So if I select this, I load in the parameters, the slider settings, etc. for these render settings. I can click load, and this brings in my render view, but also brings in the Mental Ray sliders, so it looks a little different. So let's render this and see what we get. And you can see it renders it differently. It doesn't render it from top to bottom, it renders it in blocks. And right now I'm just leaving it at the default render settings, and you can see that I've got kind of medium anti-aliasing, I've got my reflection set to medium, soft shadows, etc., etc. We don't need final gather because in this case I'm just using standard lighting. If you're doing your first render, I would recommend that you just leave these at the default and start playing around with them once you start to feel more comfortable with adjusting your render settings. So for example, if I wanted to increase the quality of my anti-aliasing, I could just bump this up a little. If I wanted to increase, say, my refractions and my reflections, I could just bump these up. Now you're going to get a better quality render from doing this, but you can see it's taking longer to render out each time. So for this example, I'm just going to leave them at the standard defaults. Click render, and there we go. If I like the result, then I could simply come to my little disk here and save out a static image of the final render that I've created. However, we don't typically just end up with a single frame. In fact, what we have here is actually a rendered animation. So how am I going to get this into a video format that I can share? Well, first of all, you really need to set up your preferences to allow you to render multiple frames. So let's take a look at our preferences and see what we're dealing with here. So I'm going to go under my rendering menu here, and I'm going to go to render setup. What this brings up by default is the common tab, and as you can see, right now I'm set to my single frame, which is why I only managed to render out a single frame. In order to render out a series of frames, we need to change this to either the active time segment or a range. Now right now my time slider is going from 0 to 100 frames, so I'm just going to use active time segment. If I wanted to render out a specific portion, though, I could just type in the range numbers manually. Alternatively, you can type in a series of random frames if you're just kind of filling in the gaps. Here we can see area to render. This allows us to render either the full frame or a particular region. In my case, I want to render the entire view. Now, output size. This is very important, and it's something you really don't want to overlook. By default, you can see that when I actually render this out, I'm rendering at 640 by 480, so it's nothing special. And if I do a quick test render here, I'm going to click on the little teapot to do the shortcut for a render view. Change this back to a single frame and try again. Okay, you can see that the view in my viewport here, my render cam, is different from the final rendered image, and that's because I'm not actually seeing the same aspect ratio. The final image shows 640 by 480. My render view is likely to change according to how big I make the window. So how do you know exactly how much you're going to be able to see in your final render? Well, that's where the actual kind of viewport cropping comes in, and this is incredibly important. So to turn this on, we just click on the little plus sign on a particular render camera and go to Configure Viewports. What you want to go to is the Safe Frames tab in the bottom right, and you'll see that by default they're turned off. Now, if we turn them on, we can actually decide what we want to actually frame. Right now I'm looking at the live area and my current render region, but you can also turn on safe regions, for example, video editing, etc. So if I click Apply after I've turned that on and OK, you can see that my view's changed, and what I'm actually seeing now is a representation of what I'll see in my render, as shown by this little yellow box. So when I click on Render, you can see that the proportions of that line up perfectly. So that's how we can actually see that our framing is correct. So that's very, very important. If we come back then to our render setup and look at our frame size, as I said, right now we're 640 by 480. I'm going to do let's do an HD render for this because it's only 100 frames. So I'm going to change my output size to HD video, but you can see you've got a whole load of different ones to choose from. HD video is going to give me square pixels, pixel aspect of 1, and an image aspect ratio of 1.7 recurring, which is 16 by 9. Now by default it's full HD, 1920 by 1080. That's a little too big for this example. So let's just do one of these other presets. Let's do 720p, which is just 1280 by 720. If I click on that, it updates. Now you can see that my render preview window, or my render region I should say, has enlarged. It's gone wider to represent 16 by 9. If I click on render, you can see I'm getting a much larger render come through now, and I can see a lot more detail in my mushroom. Let me scale this down, and you can see I've still got my settings here. Excellent. Okay, so that's my single frame setup. Be sure to check a couple of frames before you start setting off any long renders here. But let's come back to setting this to the active time segment, 100 frames. We're rendering the full view, HD video, 720p. We've got several options here we can turn on, like atmospherics and effects, and by default you won't need to touch these. Lighting setup, I'm just going to leave that at the defaults. This section here is really, really important. We'll come back to this later though, because before we get to this, I'd like to talk about the actual render settings themselves. So let's click on the Render tab here at the bottom right, and you'll see some settings specific to the Mental Ray renderer. And you've got ray tracing turned on. You've got let's see, motion blur turned off. You can turn this on if you want. It will slow down your render considerably though. I usually do it in 2D unless I have to do it in 3D, and various other options. And all these are really being set up using those presets that we loaded in earlier. So you don't really need to change them unless you're confident that you know what these attributes are doing. So let's come back to the Common tab and let's talk about how to actually prep this to set it up for rendering a series of frames. Okay. I'm going to click on this Files button here. That's going to bring a Save As dialog, and you can see that I've got my project set here to Mushroom, and it defaults to my render output folder. So I'm going to change the file name. I'm just going to put maybe Mushroom Zoom, and for the file type we've got some options here. Now you might think, well, I'm rendering a series of frames which is a video, so I should render to an AVI or some kind of other video format. Well, you'd be wrong in thinking that. You could choose an AVI if you are very confident the render is going to go without any hitches, but the problem with rendering to a video file type is if anything goes wrong during the render, and say you're 10 hours into a render, something goes wrong at, hour 10, and it corrupts the entire file, maybe your machine crashes, you've lost all 10 hours of rendering. So rather than rendering to a video file, what we actually do is we typically render to a series of static frames, and then we'll put those together into a video later on. So for my render output, I'm going to choose a PNG. I like PNGs because they're lossless, they're lossless compression, so you preserve the full quality, and they give excellent quality and smaller file sizes than, say, a TIFF. So once I've done this, I'm going to click on Save, and it's going to ask me what color mode I want to save to, and 24-bit is just fine, so I'll click OK. And we don't need to worry about creating a list of the images. You can do that for certain applications that can be useful for piecing the images back together again. Rendered frame window is fine, and that's my output set up. So once you've double checked and triple checked all of your render settings and you're ready to go, we can set off this batch render. Now I'm rendering out 100 frames here, and you've got to be cautious because rendering takes a considerable amount of time depending on the quality settings and the number of frames. So be sure to allow yourself enough time to get the render completed in order to meet your deadline, especially if you're working to a very tight deadline. So once I've got this all set up, I can click on Render, and it's going to start off my batch render. And you can see it brings up the render view. In this case though, it doesn't just stop once it's completed one frame, it actually keeps going. And that's because it's batching out all of these frames that I've set it to. If I just move off this render view to the side for a second, you can see the progress here. It says 6 of 101 frames. Yeah, I should say 101 frames, 0 to 100. And in fact, I can actually close down the render view, and you'll notice it's still rendering in the background. You can see that my little progress bar is continuing to go here. If I go inside my folder where I've got the output being saved to, you'll notice that it's starting to flood my render output with all of these files that I'm rendering out. So let's take a look at these. Bring this into view, and you can see that this is frame 1, 2, 3, 4. So you can see all my frames are starting to render out. Excellent. The next thing then is just to let this finish and come back in several minutes when it's rendered out all 101 frames. Okay, after that then, my render is finally finished, and didn't take too long really, but you can see I've got frames 0 to 100 rendered out here, and I can check a few of these to make sure that they work. Always be sure to check at every step of the process just to make sure that you don't make any mistakes and regret it later. So you can see these are coming out with a different background though. They're not coming out with that black background, and that's because these actually saved with an alpha channel, and a lot of that's thanks to the PNG. But typically when you render out something in 3D, you don't actually get this black background. That is just empty space or nothingness, and while it's technically there when you look at the image without the alpha channel, with the alpha channel you can see that it's got no background, and that's so that you can actually composite a background in later on if you wanted to, which would typically be the technique. So like I said, if we had made the error of choosing to render out to a video format such as AVI earlier on, if it corrupted, I would have lost everything. However, in this case, say I got to frame 90 and it crashed and I didn't get the rest of my render, so I had frames 0 to 89. all I'd have to do to recover those last few frames would be to come back into 3D Studio, go up to my range, and plug in frames 90 to 100, and I'd get those final frames rendered out. Easy peasy. So that's the benefit of rendering out to frames. The drawback is you've got a bunch of frames. So how do you actually convert these into video? Well, the best thing to do really, first of all, is to preview them to make sure you've got what you want. There are various third-party applications to preview a series of images as video. In this case though, we're actually going to use a tool that's built into 3D Studio and is also built into other 3D applications. But if we go under the rendering tab, we'll actually see we've got a RAM player here. So I can load this up, and this is great because it allows you to do things with your final rendered images. For example, compare one version of a render against another to look at the quality difference or the output difference, or we can load in a series of frames and view the result as a movie playing back. So I'm just going to come up to my open dialog here, which is this little open folder, so open channel A, and I'm going to click on my first frame in my render output. Gives you a few details here. The important thing here though is that it noticed, there's a whole sequence of frames. It's a sequence, so it checked that little box. And if we look at the details here, it says 101 frames, which is correct. If I click on open, it's going to actually create one of those image file sequences that we didn't create when we rendered. This is just so it knows how to handle and manipulate the frames, which direction to go, how fast, etc. So I'm going to click OK. It's going to go ahead and do that. Sets it up to the correct image size, how much memory to use, etc. Start frame, end frame, and click OK. And it starts loading in all of my frames. It's actually throwing them in RAM. If you don't have enough RAM for your whole image sequence, things might start to slow down as it starts to throw it into virtual memory on your hard drive. Once that's loaded in, all I have to do is click on my little play button, and there you go. We're viewing it as a RAM preview, all those images loaded into memory. I can see either yay or nay, love it, hate it, etc. And you can decide whether it's right to move on and actually turn this into a video, or if you need to make any corrections. This is also a great way to check if you have any corrupted frames, because they'll show up here, and so this is a great time to go back and re-render those couple of frames that might have corrupted. So let me stop that. What's really nice is if you actually use your left and right arrow keys, you can click forward and backward through your frames interactively to check them one by one. You can also adjust the frame rate here if you rendered your project out at a particular frame rate. In this case, I did do 30 frames per second. So I know this works. I'm happy with the results. If I wanted to, I could use the quick method to save this out to a video, and that's just using the RAM player here. So I just click on the little disk, save the output. I'm not going to put it in my render output. I think I'm going to put it inside, let's see, I think I'm going to create a movie folder. Throw my movie in here. And my output format, what I'm going to do in this case, I think I'm going to choose an AVI and click on save. And I guess I should put a file name in first. Let's go mushroom zoom, click on save. And now I get some options here for the codec that I want to use inside this AVI container. And the only problem is that by default 3D Studio isn't going to give you a whole lot of options. So let's just use the JPEG compressor, click OK, and it's going to save this out. So if I come back to my project folder, look inside movie, there we go. You can see it's finished rendering, 22.4 megs. If I double click on this, yeah, it's gone really dark, and one of the reasons for that is because of that codec that I use, the MJPEG compressor. Not really a great codec, not really very ultra compatible either, but it did give me a quick and easy video file. That technique is not one that I would actually recommend, because it just doesn't give you enough option as to how you want to render this out. So let's look at a better way of compiling each of these frames into a completed video. Let me show you the preferred method of doing this then. When you're doing anything, any kind of design, any kind of multimedia, you always want to use the best application for the job. 3D Studio is great at 3D, but it's pretty terrible when it comes to actually compositing together a video. In this case then, I'm using Adobe After Effects, and this really is my preferred method for doing this. You know, you could use something like Adobe Premiere as well if you don't really have any compositing to do and you just want to output to a video file. So in After Effects then, I'm just going to double click in here to bring in my render output folder. I'm going to click on my first frame. Just like 3D Studio, you can see it's found that it's a series of files, so it recognizes it as footage. Click on Open, and it's going to bring in all of those frames. Be sure to check the frame rate here. If that's not correct, then what you need to do is right click, Interpret Footage, and go to Main, and you can set up the correct frame rate here. You can change that to whatever you want. In this case though, this looks good. If I double click, I can get a preview, and you can see my black backgrounds come in again, because by default After Effects is just putting it on black. If I wanted to add in a background, then I could replace that and do some simple compositing, but I can just check all my frames here, check they look good. Okay, that's going to work just fine. So I can drag this down to my empty timeline, and I'm creating a new comp here, Mushroom Zoom. And if I wanted to, I could actually start adding in some motion blur here using some filters and effects in After Effects. I could color correct it. So like I said, this really is the preferred method of working with your final output. You know, it's very rare that you actually get the best color, you know, the most accurate backgrounds, etc. You really 99% of the time want to bring it into a compositing package, tweak the color, add the motion blur, and get it looking exactly how you want it before you commit it to a final video file. Okay, so I'm happy with this in this case, and I'm just going to go up to Composition and come down to Make Movie. If I click on that, it's going to ask me where I want to save it, and again I'm going to place it in that movie folder in my project folders. So here's that original file that I created with Max. For now I'm just going to call it Mushroom Zoom, and we'll call it After Effects. Click on Save, and now I can come in and change the output settings. The default then is lossless, and you can see that's giving me an AVI file. That's essentially uncompressed, which is going to yield a huge file. Great quality, but obviously not very transferable. So if you click on lossless, you can start to tweak the output format. Now these days H.264 really kind of is the newest kid on the block. It gives you the best quality versus size, and it's also very compatible. So I'm going to do an H.264, and millions of colors, that's great. Let's go to our format options and tweak some of this output. Now you get different profiles according to the type of video you're outputting to. You know, H.264 is a great codec, but it's not the easiest to set up out of all the codecs out there. For something like HD720, 3.1 is a good level to work with. So let's set these to something like, well, you don't want to go too low and you don't want to go too high at the same time. You really might want to do a couple of different trials here, render out a few different versions, and see which bitrate gives you the best quality versus file size. In this case, I think I'm going to do maybe 3 megabits for my target bitrate. The bitrate it's going to try and maintain, and I'll let it go up to, maybe I'll let it go up to 4.5 megabits here. Click OK, and OK. And you can see in my output here that the file name has remained the same, Mushroom Zoom After Effects, but my container has changed to MP4 to represent that new codec I'm using, the H.264 codec. So once you've got that all set up, you can just click on Render, and it starts to render out that video file. You get the little ding, it tells you it's finished. If I bring up my output folder, where I stored my movies, you can see I've got that original MJPEG file that I created from 3D Studio, which is pretty horrible and dark, 22.4 megs. Here's the version I created in After Effects using H.264. The color's much more accurate, and you can see it's only 1.22 megs, so a tiny video file. If I load this up, there we go. That quality's not too bad. Maybe next time I'd increase the bitrate slightly to get a slightly crisper finish. But you can see that gave me a nice quality video. The color's accurate, and it's also going to transfer really nicely for your showreel, or if you want to put it on YouTube, etc. And it'll work across PC, Mac, various different platforms. So there's our final output, and as I said, I really do recommend that you use After Effects or Premiere if you want to convert this into a video file and do your final compositing. Be sure to allow yourself enough time to render out, and be sure to do plenty of tests along the way to make sure that your 5 or 10 hour render is going to turn out as you like it. So that's rendering. Thanks for watching.